From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. There's so many things I love about the Extension Service, and one of them has to be this website portal called Ask Extension. It's nationwide, and basically wherever you are, if you had a question about anything, including pollinators, you can type it in and a relevant expert will get back to you in a really short period of time. Myself, other faculty members at Oregon State University, and volunteers field the questions on pollinators, and one question that comes up every year, like clockwork in the spring, I have a bumblebee nest in a birdhouse. And later in the summer, I get questions. I've got bumblebees in an attic and some insulation. I just know the time of year when I get those questions. Knew I needed a podcast episode dedicated to this question, and so I knew also who to talk to. Steve Gomes is a master beekeeper and also master melittologist in the Portland area. He's been fielding these questions for years now, and he's also really curious about bumblebees and has started to rear them at his home. It's really remarkable. So this podcast goes out, I'm going to link it out every time I get a question about bumblebees and birdhouses or any other structure, because Steve is your person and he's here with you this week on Pollination. Steve, you're here. I'm so excited to finally have you on the show. I've been plotting this episode for a while. Welcome to Pollination.
Thank you.
I remember, I remember talking with you about bumblebees one night after a Tualatin Beekeepers Association meeting, and you and I sat in front of the doorway. All the cars had left, and we must have talked for about an hour. But it was clear you had deep fascination for bumblebees.
Yes,
I can't remember. That's got to be 5 years ago now.
Oh yeah. Well, you collared me back in 2017, I believe, because this all started up in 2018 at the Oregon Gardens. You asked me my wife actually wanted that big poster of all the bees, and you used me as collateral for her to get that. So, but no, I got involved with the Oregon Bee Project at that time and the Oregon Master of Beekeepers at the same time, and it was just an interesting mix of two sides of the issue. I think in Oregon, we're very fortunate in that both of those programs are under the same roof at Oregon State. And so there's some we've got shared resources, but we also have people from both walks in both apiculture and in native pollinators that are involved in these programs. And so I think we're very unique as a state to have that. It gives us, I think, better collaboration and a lot more access to resources. So,
well, and I think the flip side of it is we have people like yourself who are, master level beekeepers. I remember going out on your disease competency. You're really thorough when it comes to bee colony, but also just expansive knowledge of native bees. And I don't, there's not a lot of people on this earth like that.
Well, it's a lot of fun. The two fields of study marry very well together. They're complementary, and in real life they affect one another. I didn't think that, I didn't think about native pollinators. I've been keeping bees for over 40 years, and the last several years being involved in this program has really opened my eyes into apiculture practices and how. I just had a conversation, TVBA membership. A couple of the members are saying how their friends who were raising peach and corn crops were being negatively affected by commercial beekeepers dumping colonies, and they were tearing up their fruit and their crops, which was their livelihood, because there were no nectar sources out there. So they were going after the fruit, anything sweet. So there's a lot of many facets to these issues that we all can kind of lean into.
The other thing that I often think is, similarly from an apiculture background and then moving into native bees afterwards, is that we know a lot about apis.
Hmm.
Apis is a well-studied, when it comes to insects, it is the exemplar when the physiology, how wax is made, like all the stuff is kind of like nicely delineated. And you're kind of confronted on the other end with bumblebees, for example, where the knowledge is scant. Like there's little dribs and drabs where someone like you who's become really fascinated with both rearing bumblebees, but also kind of helping the public relocate bumblebees, you are confronted with this wall of kind of uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, I realized that I didn't know very much, and that's one reason why I've kept going out and relocating and inspecting these nests. That's when like Link posted that information about going into the Central Cascades and finding an Occidentalis nest and the great care that they took in excavating and documenting. It's almost like an archaeological discovery, but it requires that kind of attention to detail if we're going to learn what we need to know about these creatures. We're going to have to really gather the information in a metered and effective way to be able to come up with some knowledge that can be used to help manage.
And just so listeners who don't know what you're referring to, our taxonomist Lincoln Best with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Forest Service last year went through this crazy excavation. Meters down, they found this Western bumblebee nest, and kind of going through it and kind of trying to glean as much information on it as possible. And I guess on your end of things, you're in an urban area, you're in the Portland area, and you started to deal with what I get as well. I think you've really taken it to the level you're sort of our go-to in the state now when it comes to bumblebees in the public, where somebody in their backyard has run into a bumblebee nest, and it may be I've had them underneath sheds, coming out of the structure. They're somewhere underneath they're in the foundation, or more commonly, and this is kind of past already, but there was that period, that month period where I've got these bumblebees with an orange band living in my birdhouse. That there's
Hmm.
this great, people are. So tell us a little bit about those calls and who are, what are people, how, when did you start to get interested in these calls, and sort of what's been your response?
Well, in 2018, one of my clients is Tualatin Valley Water District in Clean Water Services here in the Beaverton area. And they have thousands of water meters with those nice little metal lids and those nice little rectangular holes. And usually there's insulation, especially at higher altitudes, that's thrown in top of the metering equipment to keep it from freezing. Well, that makes just a dandy nest box. You got this little defensible hole, a metal front door, and in they go. And then the guy comes along and tries to read the meter. Once they come out of winter and they're staring at a bunch of bumblebees, and so I would go out and they would flag the box for me with a little surveying flag, and then I would go out in the evening and then I would pull the nest out and I take a picture of it and send it back to the field supervisor, let him know that box was okay to go work in, and that's how I got started doing it. And then I just kind of had my ear out. I talked to some fire stations and the police departments. I said, if you guys get issues with bumblebees, give me a call and I might be able to help you. But I got to the point where I wanted to see as many nests as I could see. I can relocate them if I can, to conserve the resource. But if I can't, then I'm going to take what I can, what's left of the nest, and curate it and turn it into educational displays. So I tell people, when I collect your nest, if it doesn't make it, it's going to go into educational outreach materials. And I show them, I pack one with me and I show it to them. I said, here's what it'll turn into. And they think that's pretty neat. And I've been taking them back into the schools now that COVID's gone off the scene. And the teachers absolutely love it. They like seeing the bumblebee nests and the honeybees, and then the collection of native pollinators. But that's how I got into it, taking care of about Tualatin Valley Water District. And it's just grown from there. The master gardeners, interestingly enough, are a very well connected group in our state. And they field a lot of calls for bumblebee nests. And getting to know Stephanie Hazen, she, started to talk to me about this, I think 3 years ago. And she said, we need somebody to field these calls. I even wanted to start up a bumblebee nest relocation effort, but it takes a set of special skills. You have to be comfortable handling angry, stinging insects. And the beekeeping side of me, I'm used to doing that. And so that's not a problem, but the bumblebees respond differently. You have to handle them a little bit differently than honeybees.
Well, what's the first thing? So I guess you get the call and somebody says, I have, oh, Mr. Gomes, people have told me, oh, you're the only person who can help. I've got these bumblebees and they're coming out of they're in my birdhouse. What do I do? What's the first thing that you say to them?
I say, send pictures.
Okay.
And I said, and I'll ask them, when did you first notice them? So that, typically they don't notice them until there's bees in there and the bees are flying at them, or attempting to defend their nest. So if I get pictures back and I said, I want to be able to identify them. And I said, the best time to take your pictures is early in the morning or just before dusk. And I said, because they'll be back, they'll be around the entrance, but they'll be quieter. They won't be coming and going. And that way I know I'm not headed out to collect a yellow jacket nest out of the ground. So, which I do. I go prepared to find a yellow jacket nest and have
to try to talk them down from removal?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I asked them, well, what is your reason for removing them? Sometimes people have been, I had this one wonderful 88-year-old lady who had a birdhouse on the side of her greenhouse right next to the door. And every time she'd open and close the door, those ladies that come boiling out and she'd get stung. She'd probably been stung 8 times. And she just said, I can't, I've got to get into my greenhouse. And so I moved the birdhouse off of her greenhouse over to the far corner of her yard on the fence. And that solved the problem for her. And so that's what I try to do first. I said, if you can change your habits around the nest, it will be gone by the end of summer. And I said, is that possible here? It being inconvenient is one thing, but impossible is another thing. And if they have someone else,
I've done that as well, and people are just not aware that it's an annual nest. They think it's going to keep going, and if they don't deal with it now, but when you tell them it's by the end of summer, it's going to collapse.
Yeah, I have these little placards that I send out with the. I'm just showing this to you, Andoni.
Yeah.
But it shows the life cycle of the nest. And I have those with me in my box that I take when I harvest a nest. And it just shows them that this is a nest that starts with a solitary queen and it goes through summer, then it declines once the gynes, the new queens are out and the males are out. And there's nothing stored for it to overwinter. I says it just becomes fodder for other creatures to consume. So, yeah, in that understanding, and then also I said if you can reduce traffic around it, or sometimes moving a barrier. I had a lady put up she had a kind of a partition that she had in her garage, and she brought it outside and threw some sandbags on it, and the bees had to go to the left or the right. They couldn't come straight out and fly into the yard. So she created a way to divert the bees and left them in place.
Okay.
But there's some management things. And sometimes there's construction constraints that are going on. People are tearing something apart or remodeling it, and the bees are right in the middle of it, and you have to move them. They're either going to get moved or the nest is going to fail.
So let's say you got an underground nest. It's right by where the high traffic area. Let's say it's like a municipal park, and it's like how do you do the relocation? What's involved there?
Well, I let them know that I'm going to be out there about an hour after dusk. My goal is to collect all the individuals I can. I don't want to do it during the day. And if it's really warm out, sometimes there's individuals that overnight in flowers remote from the nest. And I always let them know that I said, we may not get every single bee. There may be a few of them that are hanging around that didn't make it back to the nest at night. But we're going to try to come late. And then what I do is I prepare. The first thing I do is I clear the area around the nest entrance carefully, not to disturb them, and then I use my vacuum with my special containment chamber in it. It's a very gentle vacuum, and what I'm doing is I'm pulling them into this containment chamber that has a lot of holes in it, and I collect all of the defensive bees off the nest, And what you'll do is you'll continually, if you provoke the nest, they'll come out, and I just suck them up right off the entrance, and they go into this jar. And I keep doing that until I don't get any more individuals. Occasionally one may come out of the nest and look at you and then run right back down into it. Once you get to that point, you can collect the nest. You can pick it up and gently lift it out of wherever it's at. And this can vary widely. I've taken nests out of old furniture that was behind a garage in the upholsterer's cotton, out of a bramble, a pile of brambles. I've had to cut a whole bunch of sticks away slowly, and then come up with a grapefruit-sized cluster in the middle of all of this. So often they're on the ground on top of leaves and decaying wood. Just a variety of substrates that they're in. But what I try to do is I try to define the edges of the nest and where the mantle is. And the mantle is the wax cap that goes over the top, and they'll have a couple entrances in it. But once I define where that is, I have just a couple of very slender pry bars, and I will go around and loosen the dirt. What my whole goal is to get my hands underneath that nest in its entirety, and then lift it and gently set it down in a box. And then the boxes that I have are like, 9 by 12, about 8 inches tall, and they're like a little tiny beehive with a bottom that's screwed on. There's no bottom entrance. There's just a little hole in the front that I cover with steel wool, and then I have a Lexan cover that allows me to look down into it. But once I set that nest in there, then what I'll do is I'll take that small jar that was in that collection vacuum, and I'll take it home with me.
Extra bees.
Put it in the refrigerator for about 10 minutes, cool them down, and once they're moving a lot slow, then I just lift the Lexan lid and pour them onto the nest, and then everyone's reunited. And then I'll set them in a new location. I do this all in the dark. Set them in a new location, leave them there for about an hour, let them calm down, and then I'll pull the steel wool out of the entrance. And then in the morning, they find they're in a new spot and reorient.
Amazing.
But my goal is to keep the queen who founded that nest intact with her nest and with all of her workers, as many as possible, so they can continue building that nest and eventually rear queens at the end of the season and have it be a success reproductively.
What are some of the tips? Let's say there's some people listening to this and they're in Washington or Idaho and they'd like to take this up. What are some of the places that you get stuck? And I like the idea of the vacuum, a gentle vacuum, just to kind of like waft away the bees. Because I imagine if you go in there without taking the bees away, it's just you have bees on your arms, and it's just like all over the place.
You want to it's animal husbandry. It's those skills. How do I get the critter to go and do what I need it to do for its benefit and mine? And with the bumblebees, I want to collect all the defensive bees. I found that it's far easier to deal with the nest. It's like when you do a cutout with honeybees, you'll open up the wall and you'll just vacuum them into a super that has frames. And once you get all of the foragers and the guard bees sucked up into that chamber, you're left with just the nurse bees who adhere to the comb and the queen, and those are really a lot easier to handle without all those defensive bees trying to chase you off. And so that's the first thing is get yourself a vacuum. I've got details about how I built mine. I built mine out of a Milwaukee battery powered 12-volt vacuum, and I just came across one today. It's at Harbor Freight. I'm going to post it too. It shows great promise, and it's a lot less money than the Milwaukee, and it has a semi viewable dust chamber on it, so you could kind of keep track of what's going on inside of it. But that really has turned out. I made that vacuum to collect bees for the Bee Atlas, and it wasn't a good idea for that, but it was a great idea for dealing with the bumblebees. So it's worked really well.
So you need to wear a bee suit, but I imagine a smoker isn't going to help you in this.
You don't want to smoke them.
Okay,
you're going to irritate a nest at night, and that's just like irritating. And at night with bees are things. It's like oil and water; they don't mix. They compound, they amplify the issue. But with bumblebees, they are very ominous sounding. And if you just have to be patient, you move slow and you're gentle with them. And like I said, the key thing for me is collecting the defensive individuals. They're going to come out. There's going to be ones that charge out and want to challenge you, and you just suck them up with a vacuum cleaner. You wait, you provoke and wait and provoke and wait and provoke and wait. And when there's no more challengers, then you just dig a little bit deeper, and you may find a few more, but essentially you're down to the nest and those that are caring for what's in the nest. And no one else is going to come out and bother you. And you just have everything ready. I will take a 5x7 plastic tarp with me, and I will put it right close to where the nest is, and I'll move any material onto that. And that way, if bees exit, I'm not sucking up dirt with them. I'm just getting the bees off of the tarp. And just prepare everything, have it all ready. Have extra batteries. I actually use one more item. I have a really strong neon work light, and it's directional, and I can vary the amount of light that it puts out. And if I've got bees that decided to fly, I will put this down next to the nest, and they will fly down to that light. The only light that I have on my body is a red LED, and I use that to view the nest. But I use that light to attract those bees and collect them with the vacuum if any of them fly. Oh. So that seems to work really, really well. So,
how many nests do you collect in a year? How's this? How?
2 years ago, I collected 30. I'm looking here, 36.
Wow.
Varying sizes. This year, I've only collected 8 so far, but it's been a really cold with spring, and so I think a lot of them either didn't start or got started late. And,
are they mostly Bombus vosdensenskii and Bombus melanopygus, or?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what's the last species that I collected. It was last year. It was a guy was doing tractor work out in Oregon City. I was out there collecting a swarm, and he says, "I got more bees over here." And he had churned up a bumblebee nest, and it was I can't remember what it was. It wasn't Grigiacolis, it was something else. Anyway, I'll have to look back and see. Yeah. But it was the nest had been flipped over with a plow, but it was intact, and so I was able to gather it all up and bring it home, and it finished out its season here in my backyard. But more often than not, it's those 2 species. So.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break. I want to come back and ask you just a couple more questions, if I can, about rearing bumblebees, which you started to take up more recently.
Okay.
Okay, we are back. So you have, I first saw this on Facebook. I was just like, what? My goodness, you're pulling this off. So you have been spring trapping mated queens and rearing them inside, at least getting the nests initiated. Tell us about that. Why on earth did you? I mean, I can sort of piece together. Your interest in bumblebees has been deepening, but how did you get? Where did you start? Like, did you have a resource? Was there a book, or did you just kind of like wing it?
Well, when I started relocating bumblebees, I got to talking with a fella in the Department of Forestry down at Oregon State, and he was really interested in getting a hold of nests. And I asked him why, and he says, "Well, we can't import bumblebees into Oregon." And I said, "Well, that's interesting." And that I didn't think anything more of it for a while. And then as I got deeper into the native pollinators and then the interaction between honeybees, apiculture, and native pollinators, I wanted to have some specific questions answered. One of them was, are there any specific diseases when it comes to apiculture and native pollinators? And you get deformed wing virus, and you get nosema in bumblebees. They're specific species, but they are susceptible to those things. And so our apiculture practices can influence the vitality of our native bumblebee populations. where those honeybees are placed, what sort of populations of bumblebees are there, and we don't know that much about them. We don't know which ones are more vulnerable to these diseases or less, or any of that. So we've got so much to learn, and so I thought to myself, well, there may be some value in rearing bumblebees, native ones, here in Oregon, and I have some friends who kept property out in North Plains. They have about 3 acres of blueberries. Known them for 30 years, and I've surveyed their property for part of the bee atlas, and there were 5 species of bumblebees out there at one year. And this year before last, they had a horrible fruit set, and I went out and I looked, and there were no bumblebees out there for the most part. Very, very low population. But we had severe winter and very cold, wet spring, and so I started thinking to myself, well, if I could gather bumblebees from an area where they're plentiful, and not too far away, and captive rear them, and then take those nests out there, they might get a better fruit set. And I thought, well, I don't know anything about that, so I started to do research, and people that have been rearing bumblebees, they kind of keep their techniques pretty close to the chest. They don't share information. They don't want to talk about it. I did come across one group in Canada that's just trying to captive rear native bumblebees for conservation purposes, and we're starting a dialogue about how they do it versus
Wildlife Conservation Canada. We had them on. We had a podcast on them, actually.
Yeah. So anyway, interesting folks, very high tech in their approach. But anyway, what I wanted to do was to help my friends with their fruit set issue, and learn a little bit about rearing these in a captive situation. And so that I went out and I started doing research, and I started doing this in 2019, and on a small scale, and I've tried like 3 or 4 ways it didn't work. And then I came across an interesting book published by University of Minnesota Extension, and by Elaine Evans, Ian Burns, and the very famous Marla Spivak.
Yeah.
And what she did is she had grad students that were learning how to raise bumblebees, and they went out and they gleaned different techniques, and then they tested them in the lab, and published this little book called Befriending Bumblebees. And so I got a hold of a copy of it and went through it, and then went through the references on biology and on rearing bumblebees, and just started to go find out what was true and what was not, and what was a hearsay when it came to actually doing this. And each year my success has gotten better and better. This year, I got to about the 4th week, and then I had a huge die off in the bees. Both the queens and the workers just died, and so I'm doing research right now into what sort of diseases occur in captive rearing, and if anybody's willing to talk about it, because that's the ugly side of animal husbandry. When my creature has died, am I going to tell anybody about it because it makes me look bad? But that's to me some of the most profound research. That's when science really becomes a very useful tool, is when we bear ourselves and we look at what we've done and how we've done it, and try to learn from that. And that's why I'm very grateful to have a university and the resources around. But anyway, that's how I got started.
So walk us through just how does this start? Like, tell us how you started the season.
Well, the very first thing you have to do is you have to find out where and when the local populations of overwintered queens come out and forage at the very beginning of the year. They have used up their fat reserves, and they need to get their strength and vigor back so they can found the nest. And so heather is probably the best one in a suburban environment. It is blooming in February, and it blooms all the way through the end of March. And it's a good nectar and pollen source. And so I found a couple places with large plantings of heather. The next plant.
Okay, so these already mated wintered queens, they already been mated the previous year. They pop out, they start foraging on the heather, and then Steve comes.
Yeah, and so I'm looking, and what you have to do is you have to watch these areas closely, because as the weather warms up, they'll come out at the earliest possible time, and they may only come out for an hour or two during the day. They know when the weather's right. And there's a book written by Bert Heinrich. It's called Bumblebee Economics. And if you really want to get sick and deep when it comes to bumblebees, that's a good book to start with. He talks about the thermoregulation that bumblebees exercise to be able to survive. And they're really amazing as to how they do it. But they know how much energy they can expend to get out to this nectar and pollen source and gather whatever they can get, and then get back to a hiding place without going in the red. And that's the main deal. They have got to keep gaining fat and be able to get to the point where they can lay eggs and have enough pollen stored in the burrow that they pick, abandoned rodent burrow, to be able to start a nest. So what you're going to do is you're going to intervene at the point between them replenishing their stores physically and starting a nest. And you go to these flowers, you find the queens that have not got any pollen on their legs. And you can usually watch them. They behave differently. The queens that have established nests are very deliberate. They don't hang around. They don't look for holes around the heather. They gather the pollen and then they're out of there. So you avoid those queens. You're gathering the ones without pollen on their legs.
Oh,
and
because
you're
they've already
those.
started a nest. Then you don't want
Exactly.
one that hasn't started yet. Okay, gotcha.
Right. There may be a clutch of eggs back there that she's got to get back to and continue to incubate. So what you do is you have made small nesting chambers, and in befriending bumblebees, there's websites that you can go to look at different designs of these. But they're a small box, about 3 inches by 3 inches by 6 inches long, and they are divided into two chambers. One you exclude the light from, the other one you provide a nectar source in. And the divider has a small half-inch hole that the queen can climb to and fro between these chambers. But anyway, you put her in a dark, warm place, in the mid 80s, about 60% humidity. Make it nice and dark, like she would be underground in a burrow. And you leave her with a pollen ball that's been dipped in beeswax, fresh pollen. This is not dried, it's fresh. And about 3/8 of an inch diameter.
Honeybee trapped pollen.
Honeybee trapped pollen. The fresher, the better, because they're looking for high quality food. Okay. And she will consume as much of that as she possibly can. And you may have to replenish it after a week or 3 days because she's eaten so much of it. But you leave her a ball, and what she does is she lays eggs on that ball, half dozen eggs or so, and then she'll incubate them with her body. Over a period of about 3 to 4 weeks, those eggs will go through metamorphosis, pupate, and eventually you'll get small workers. And those workers will vary in size depending on the amount of pollen that she is able to feed, provide for food for them. But once they emerge, they start taking over the duties of building wax cups and foraging, and her duties primarily become feeding herself and laying eggs. And you're also, I
guess you're also feeding nectar at the same time.
Oh yes, yeah. There's the design of these nesting boxes. They're elevated up in the air about 2.5 inches, and you put a little sauce cup underneath there that you would get ketchup or something, a condiment in. You pierce a hole on the top of that and put a plastic straw through with a cotton gauze pad rolled up as a wick. And what it does is it's up against the screen on the bottom side of this secondary chamber in the nest box, and that's where she will get her carbohydrate from. It's from that nectar, and it's a thin syrup. It's 1 part water to a 1/4 part sugar, so it's very thin.
So basically, she doesn't need to leave because you've supplied all the resources there. Yeah. She just has to focus on rearing her brood.
Yes, and about 50% of the queens that you will confine will show tendencies to make a nest. If within 2 weeks they're not doing anything, I take them back to where I collected them and I release them and let them have a shot at doing it. And the interesting thing is this year, all of the queens that I caught that didn't do well, they gained weight. They were bigger and fatter and well fed. So when I released them, the chances of survival, I figured, would probably be a lot higher because they weren't out there in that cold, wet weather, not getting to the sources that they needed. So Hopefully I did some good for them, and they were able to establish nests. But out of, let's say, out of 10 queens that you gather, 5 of them may attempt to establish a nest, and out of those 5, 2, maybe 3, will actually do it. And so there's there's just enough variability, things that we don't know that affect that nesting behavior that would limit that. And I asked Lincoln. I said, what percentage of the queens that are produced out of a nest each year actually found a nest the following year? And he couldn't give me an answer. He says there's too many variables. There's the environment, there's the food supply, there's predation, there's diseases. It can vary from year to year.
I remember reading the old studies of Hobbes, the nest box studies, and just how many dead queens are at the entrance. That a queen goes in and finds a nice spot, and another one comes in, and so there's like this pile of dead queens that just can accumulate at a good spot. They're just duking it out for good real estate.
It is. You look at that and you go, what a terribly inefficient way to reproduce a species. But there's a side of that. From a competitive perspective, the strongest, most vigorous queens survive. I had one honeybee queen that I took out of my overwintered queen bank, and I just, as an experiment, I said, well, I've got 10 queens in here, and 6 of them made it through the winter, and I'm just going to throw one back into the bank and let her be the queen there. I said, they've fed her all year long. They know who she is, along with the other 6 that survived. I figured there'd be no problem. The next time I looked at that queen, her wings were all torn up. They'd plucked all the hair off of the top of her body, but she was still laying eggs. But they had really been rough on that queen. And I'm sure that in a competitive environment, those queens will battle it out for a prime nest spot. And, because that's passing on those genetics is what that is. So,
okay, so you've gone through and you've kind of gotten the system and you've kind of hit a bit of a roadblock. What are you going to try next year when you try this? Try to kind of bring them all. I imagine the goal is you bring them all the way to reproduction.
Yeah, I'd like to bring a half dozen of them all the way through to full nests. What happens is here's the goal. Once you start on these small nest boxes, when you get to about 20 individuals, then you will move them into a larger chamber, because at that point they can start foraging, and you support them for a couple more weeks with pollen and nectar as they get attuned to flying out of the nest and foraging. You have them in a permanent location, and then you just let that nest grow. You just unplug from it and let them gather the pollen and the nectar they need to be able to continue to grow. And so I was probably about 2 weeks away from that, when I lost my nest. So I'm going to do a lot of research into possible mechanisms for the failures that I found, and how to avoid that. I'm going to be talking to Dr. Spivak at great length and find out, if she ran into those sorts of things when they were using these methods. I'm sure they did. But like I said, a lot of the commercial bumblebee rearing operations hold their techniques close to their chest. And one of the things that I did find out through this one study authored by Robin Owen, is called Rearing Bumblebees for Research and Profit, Practical and Ethical Considerations, is that a lot of these, most of these commercial bumblebee producers have quite high disease levels, in the 70+% infestation rates. Their bees are not healthy. They are infested with various things. Deformed wing virus is one of them. Nosema bombini, is a form of nosema that infests them. So when they are imported into different areas for commercial use, like in tomato greenhouse pollination, they're bringing diseased bees in, and quite often they're Bombus terrestris, they're non-natives, and they are going to affect the local populations if they escape. And part of the study was actually looking outside of these commercial operations where these had been brought in. They had found mature bees out on forage outside of the greenhouse, so they know that they're escaping. So anyway, those are considerations in all of this. So Just
Well,
a
and I
long.
imagine with that industry as well, they also have run into the problems that you like. This is doing this semi-artificially has all of these places where things could
Yes,
go wrong.
yes, and and in the end, there's something about a creature reproducing in its natural environment that you can't match. I just pulled a log out of one of my mentees' yards that had a feral honeybee nest in it. I split it down the sides, but anyway, I'm going to repopulate that log with a nest and let them draw out comb, and so it can be opened up so people can actually see the kind of environment that honeybees would inhabit on their own without any human intervention. And I believe the same thing with bumblebees is that, if we provide the right nectar and pollen resources for them early in the season, I think that's one of the problems in the rural areas. There's so much and hedgerows that are gone now. We don't have the habitat, that little bit of habitat out there that they need, and the resources on it to be able to make it and produce a nest. And I think that's one of the neat things about the bee project is a lot of this has been brought to light, and to see some changes take place and see those populations rebound, it's going to be a good thing. It'll be a good thing for the agricultural practices and the land use practices, and just a change in the way we think about things. So.
Well, Steve, I wish you luck. I am learning so much from your experiments, and I really love this about the volunteers in both the Master Melitologist and Master Beekeeping program that you are. It is very kind of cooperative and gregarious, and people share ideas. And I'm learning a lot from your experiments. They've been wonderful.
Well, thanks for coming to Oregon and getting us all stirred up about pollinators.
That was years ago, man. I'm
yeah.
now.
Well, look what you've done to us. A good thing. So thank you.
Well, thank you for taking the time with us today.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.